Yeah. I just felt like I needed to do this video before like loading any more content over at CombatOddsHQ, because I needed to kind of explain my absence a little bit, and like basically everything that went on in my absence. But not only that, kind of like the whole story behind the website, the YouTube channel, and myself, and how I fit into all of this and how I fell into all of this. So I was a big sports bettor since I was a kid. My dad had me filling out like parlay cards and pro line tickets. I wasn't really profitable as a single game bettor, but I had like a system betting parlays and doing round robin, kind of unconventional ways of betting that kind of just made watching sports more fun. I wouldn't say I made money doing it, but I definitely broke even more weeks than not, or at least didn't lose, like in the long run, didn't lose enough that I was, losing money. Oh, in the, throughout the year, I was probably making at least some money. I was a big pro wrestling fan as a kid. So naturally, as I got older, MMA was the next step from like, fake combat sports to real combat sports. I was always into boxing as a kid and a teenager, got big into MMA when, the GSP era started in Canada, when that whole rise in popularity happening with his wave of exposure. I went to school in Toronto, was involved in the music scene here for a few years from like 2006 to 2010. I moved back home and worked in the mines and the smelter in Sudbury from like late 2010 until 2015. Got sick of my hometown again and moved with my buddy in suburban Toronto in 2015, and then eventually moved back to Toronto in September of 2015 because I basically just wanted to live downtown during the Blue Jays 2015 playoff run. I started working at a sports bar in Toronto called The Contender in September of 2015. And basically, as far as, my betting on combat sports, the rest was history from there. We were betting on fights, just, the people at the bar every single weekend, because just the fights was one of the things that drew the most at a sports bar, and especially in between like late 2015 to 2017. One of my biggest cashes was Amanda Nunes against Miesha Tate at 3-1 odds. Put down about like $600 and cashed quite a bit of money on that one with a buddy. We put down, I think it was like $1,200 between us, and we walked away with about almost $4,000 that night. That was a huge casher. And then a little bit later, Nunes again against Ronda Rousey at plus 170. That was another great casher. Nunes very early was in, from me betting on combat sports, very early for me was one of those go-to fighters that anytime she was an underdog, I was all over her. We were kind of running, not, I wouldn't say running a book, but just doing like fantasy and stuff like that, doing squares for UFC and MMA and boxing events. But all in all, I was working for someone else. So it was a good 2 years of getting really deep into combat sports in general. But in the end, I was working for someone else. So I felt like I was kind of, I've gone as far as I could when in that industry and working in service and stuff like that. So a few days after McGregor Mayweather, I think it was like September 5th or something like that. This guy has a birthday party at the bar, and I'm there by myself and cooking chicken wings and, just trying to handle like a party of like 18 at the bar by myself. And this guy asked me to put the Cubs game on. And I'm like, yeah, I can do that. We got like 1,000 channels. It's not a big deal. I can get any game you want. And then he asked me again, can you put this game on, the Clippers game or whatever? I put that game on. And he was just like shocked that I could, I was just bang on doing it, no problem, at his whim. And he just started telling me that he was a pro sports bettor and he was about to move to Costa Rica, and he was working for a company called Sportsbook Review, and his name was Jimmy the Bag. And he, I felt like I really related to what he was saying to me that night, and I was just like, yeah, I feel like I could do this. And I feel like, as I was already thinking a little bit prior to that, I'm kind of like limiting myself, and I needed to take a chance. So that night did not go well for me, just as having to deal with this birthday party at the bar by myself. So, there was some disagreements as a manager, and just, some stuff that went down between me and the ownership that I kind of regret, but it is what it is. And the next day I quit my job and started looking for a gig that could make me some money, and decided to get into sports betting as more than a hobby. And I had a bunch of money that I wanted to, invest in myself. So for better or for worse, I thought I decided to invest a large majority of that into a bankroll for sports betting. And, I started to stay in contact with Jimmy, started to get close with Jimmy. And he came back from Costa Rica. I think it was in March of 2018. And we started talking, and he got me a writing gig and got me appearing on his show, Betting with the Bag, on SBR's YouTube channel. And around that time, I started working in live sporting events and music production again. I got a job with the Teamsters Union and kind of just started focusing on working. Working at the Air Canada Center, but I started really focusing more on combat sports in a way that's the same way that I was focusing on it with like football, with like traditional betting trends and systems and stuff like that. And I had it kind of broken down really good with tennis. And we watch a lot of tennis at the sports bar too, and a lot of guys bet on tennis. And I noticed that like tennis, it's an individual sport, and there's a lot of individual, styles make matchups, styles make matches in tennis, and very similar to MMA. So I started to get more into tennis and into combat sports. Then in the summer of 2018, I started Spark Sports, which was kind of a website, SparkSports.ca, that was a database for sports betting trends of all kinds. Like I just mentioned, I had a bunch of people volunteering, doing writing, and it was just like a WordPress blog, basically something that grew out of just a few Twitter chats and Facebook groups that we started doing, YouTube streams, and I eventually, bought and started up, like I said, SparkSports.ca. And, I was already obligated to what I started with SparkSports.ca. And to be honest, with the bankroll I was working with, I didn't want to get like a legit job yet. So I was trying to, figure out ways to make even like another side job. So SBR, they did the IFBC in Vegas in 2018. And I went and had a meeting with some people and was going to try to get in with them on another level, maybe to do social media management on their platform. But in the end, it didn't really pan out. And I just kept being featured on Jimmy's show about 2 or 3 times every 2 weeks. And again, I was obligated to Spark Sports, and I didn't really want to get a legit job because I was still riding off that that bankroll, but it started to become like my main source of income. So again, I think it was around the end of the summer of 2018 when I met Jay from New Jersey, and we started talking about our projects, and he had a project that he was thinking of doing, and we were involved in the group. A bunch of people on like gambling Twitter were involved in the Money Gang with like King Rail and Jay and Aunt L, and just a whole bunch of just OG gambling Twitter people. And I was kind of hesitant to do anything with anybody else, and as was Jay. So we kind of gravitated towards each other. I was still trying to get Spark Sports off of the ground, and Jay started the Sports Keg. And I appeared on his channel a bunch with those dudes, with Sports Keg Jay and Anthony L. and Maxwell Smart and Tyler and Dave Betts and all those guys. They were awesome at, it was a sweet place to hang out, sweet channel to hang out, for 8 hours at a time and bet on sports on YouTube. We got, especially on the UFC nights, because, internationally there's people that'll search looking for the fights on UFC. So if you write, UFC 248 live stream, there people are searching for the word UFC 248 live. So, you're going to end up getting on nights like that huge amounts of viewers, thousands, right? And they're all going to ask you, are you going to show the fights? So their thing kept growing and growing. And along with Spark Sports, we kind of just had a bunch of growth, and I had a bunch of opportunity with that SBR and appearing on Jimmy's show. And Jimmy and SBR did the Summit of Champions in Miami in August of 2019. And that's kind of when things got interesting. I started to take more of a prominent role as a sports writer for SBR. Before, I was only literally doing like 1 or 2 things a year. But after the Miami thing, that's when we really I was getting Rick on their content schedule and, taking more of a prominent role. I was making good money with them, to be honest. And, while we were there was some talk about them doing a nightly live show with the guys from the Sports Keg. And by then, they had like hundreds of shows and thousands of hours of YouTube. And they were getting a good following on their own at the time. So Jay got on with SBR, and they started doing the Live Line, which was a nightly sports betting show. And I'd be featured on it from time to time on Jay's show, mostly just for the UFC events. And this time around this time is when I really started again to put, other sports aside even more, and really started to dig deep in the UFC and MMA and boxing. And, Jay, obviously, and he still is, but obviously then just a super sharp MMA bettor. And not only that, but he had like the balls to lay big stakes. And, he probably still does, and, had a really good track record of hitting on those spots. So the show worked. It was really entertaining because there was some good small talk and a lot of good sports betting information. And then from time to time, we had guys just dropping bombs and laying big stakes like Jay would on fights. And I personally have to say, I got to thank Jay and Dave. And that period of time, it really pushed me, to perfect my craft, to keep up with them in a completely different way, mind you, but to keep up with them as a handicapper and a researcher in MMA betting. So that went on. So then we reach the spring of 2020. And, what this means is COVID. And, SBR before that was kind of now winding down with Jimmy the Bag. And he was kind of looking for another gig. And the Live Line was still doing really good. But I think Jay and those guys wanted to see if they could kind of parlay their success into something else away from SBR. And I was featured on their show still from time to time, but kind of just kept banging away with Spark Sports and doing writing gigs with them and whatever I can get in the industry to make money, basically, along with betting on fights. So I think it was UFC 248 was the last time that I was on their show, because I actually remember specifically us talking about COVID. I think it was a few shows before this, talking about COVID, and a few people saying, it was nothing to worry about, it's hysteria. And I was kind of getting like jabbed and dismissed for saying, you can say it's not a big deal, but if it was your friends and family dying, you'd probably change your mind about it. So anyways, UFC 248, that great fight, Wiley Zhang and Joanna Jędrzejczyk, that fight, along with the easily forgettable Yoel Romero versus Israel Adesanya that night. That was the last time that I was on their show because, COVID hit. We had a big conversation about Jay doing Sports Cake content again and getting away from SBR that night. So, a few days later, COVID hits, and I seem to be the only one that's like kind of taking it seriously. I seem to be the only one of that group of people, with all due respect, that thinks it's not ridiculous what's happening. And I'm Canadian, but it was a stressful time, and there was just things specifically about Donald Trump that were said in private, and we kind of just had our differences, and I took it upon myself to remove myself from that group of people, and I went my way without the Live Line or the Sports Keg crew from there, basically. So that's how that ended, at least from there. So I got at that point, it was like a week later after UFC 248, I believe it was March 7th. So it was like the Saturday after that was the 14th. And I think that was UFC Brasilia. By that point, I was laid off from my job, from my real life job, because we mostly do the Raptors and the Leafs. So I was laid off of my in real life job in mid-March. I could pay my rent with my bankroll, but that was eventually going to run out. And, thankfully, and I got to give it to SBR, they let me write for them for a few months during the pandemic, right at the start of it, for them, just trying to get some traffic, as much traffic as they could during the lockdown. But then even that dried up. So I was out on my own, looking for places that needed sports betting content. Then I think it was like late April. Jimmy the Bag, once again, such a mensch this guy is. He got me a gig with this new company. Some people that were involved with SBR, they were doing something else. He told me they were looking for content, and so I jumped on. I started doing UFC content with Clint from the Die Hard MMA podcast, and me and him were both writing for them. We were doing good UFC stuff over at what was known as Odds.com. So that was a good little run. We covered, the big return of the UFC at UFC 249 in Jacksonville, and we were making money. The site was thriving because the UFC was one of the only sports that was going on at that point. So it was a good saving grace for me to be able to make money writing about betting on fights. So just another complete side note, at the same time, I lived in an apartment. This was during basically the COVID lockdowns. I lived in an apartment that had like a shared backyard. And I remember that night, UFC 249, it was May 9th. And the people, we were in lockdown, and the people in my backyard had a full on party with guests. We were in COVID lockdown. So, called the landlord, complained. He told me there was nothing he can do, all this stuff. So that was super stressful. And me and my partner ended up moving because of this, because this just continued. So that was a whole other story, but that was the spring of 2020. We just had to move because it was getting worse and worse. So that ended up, that was just a side note, that was something personal that was going on, but it kind of just came and went, and it was for the best. So the odds.com thing, it went on and it was good. And I think it was about mid-June or maybe a little bit before then, when odds.com brought on Jay from the Sports Keg on as an editor. And I kind of was really like, whatever, it's all good. And I didn't really mesh well with him, obviously, him and his crew, because of what was said earlier about COVID and all of that. And there were some cryptic tweets and things like that, and I wasn't really a fan of it. So I gave my notice to odds.com because, I just didn't want to be associated with that again. And I felt like I would be better off doing my own content and just plugging away, with combat sports betting content on my own platform at Spark Sports. So then more time went by, and I think, again, it was Jimmy the Bag, September of 2020. And once again, I just got to say, there aren't a lot of good people in the sports betting content industry, but Jimmy the Bag is not one of those not good people. He is an absolute mensch, and I wouldn't have anything in this line of work if it wasn't for him, as my story clearly indicates. So September 2020, Bill from odds.com calls me, asks me if I have experience with WordPress and writing and editing sports betting content. I tell him yes, obviously, absolutely. And from there, I start as the editor and then become the web manager of odds.com. Along the way, because of OddsHQ was doing such a good job with the UFC, they had the final weigh-in show that was getting a ton of views every week. And I noticed there was a lack of space in the post-show market. Like, you looked on YouTube and there was like the MMA fighting post show, which is just absolutely amazing. But beyond that, there's the Bloody Elbow, which is more of just a podcast. And then like, that's it. There's a lot of people that do the live stuff. Like I was talking about how Jay and them did, and you get that boosted ratings because of the people searching for the fights on YouTube. But I noticed there was just a gap in that content. So back in October 2020, I decided that, odds.com, sorry for in the background, I got a siren, live in a much busier area now. So anyways, yeah, October 2020, I decided that we should do a post show for UFC events, recapping the betting results. And I would go over, how many fights did the favor win? How many fights did the over betting total cash in? The division betting trends for the night, which I had been following and publishing since the Spark Sports days. So we did it. It was UFC 254, Habib versus Gaethje. It was the first day that we did it. It was an afternoon. It was supposed to be me, Guru, and Bleed. And I think Guru had something going on and had to bail respectfully, I think. So we went ahead with just me and Bleed. And man, it was a good show. From start to finish, the whole run that we had. And the reason that I picked Bleed is because I thought he was a great host. I thought he was really able to keep the pace up in shows and save people like me when they got lost or whatever, which obviously happens. None of us are true professionals from the start. So I kind of leaned on Bleed for that sharpness as a broadcaster. And I was the stat guy and he the host, and he kind of carried the show. But I mean, in the end, we went from UFC 254 to UFC 260 on odds.com on Saturday nights, every single fight night in between from those 2 points. And it was dope. And it was a great thing to be a part of. And things like this with odds.com, it didn't work out. And I don't know exactly what happened, but we all got laid off in the end of March 2020. All of the shows got canned, and me and Bleed, I felt like we had such a good thing going on. And so we went ahead and continued with the show. And at first it was just the post show, but then it became Bloodshed on his channel, which again was just absolutely awesome. And we had a really good response from our viewers, and it was just growing and growing. And obviously we lost a ton of viewers after we had to leave Odds HQ and their channel. That channel had like 20,000 subscribers, while Bleeds had like 1.8 thousand at the time. So I think it wasn't the same eyeballs, but everyone that was there from Odds HQ was coming over for a reason. It was because, again, a ton of fun content. We were reliable, and there was this huge space that we were still, besides MMA fighting and the Bloody Elbow, there wasn't that much to compete with. It's kind of different now because I feel like everybody else caught on. But yeah, it was a ton of fun, awesome to be a part of. And from there we went solo on Bleed's channel from UFC Vegas 23 all the way up to UFC 265. So the way it worked, we did the live shows on his channel, and then I created CombatOddsHQ. And I turned SparkSports.ca into CombatOdds.ca. We did the live shows on his channel, and I cut up the videos for each fight. And we just did the same way that we did at Odds HQ. And I put up the cut up videos on Combat Odds YouTube channel. and I just created a database of all these results and betting trends, just like we were doing over at OddsHQ. And on CombatOdds.ca, we were just, linking to all these videos that were the results. So it worked out really well. And like I said, we went from UFC Vegas 23 all the way up to UFC 265. And then Bleed decided that he wanted to start doing content on his own again, which I totally respected. And I said it from the start. Bleed carried the show, and it was his choice. He wanted to continue. It was his choice if he wanted to continue or not back in April when he got off from odds.com. After all of that, it was just a favor to me to continue doing the show that I created. So with that said, again, I've said this before, I wish him all the best, and it was a super fun thing to be a part of. So now we go up to more recent times, August of 2021. I decided, I got to try to keep this momentum going, try to keep it up. I did a few post shows by myself, not really the same energy. I had Lucky Locks Picks come on. He came on to the show, who's an awesome dude from Eastern Canada, and I'll have him on the show hopefully again soon. Really sharp capper, a guy, he was there when I needed somebody, so I'll always be vouching for him, just as a capper and just as a person in general. So shout out to him. Check him out on Twitter at Lucky Locks Picks. And then we get up to September 11th, the September 11th break. The last video we did, I was talking about Holyfield versus Belfort. We wrapped it up. I said I was going out to a friend's to watch the fights, and that's basically like where things left off with the channel because of the whole story that I got into at the beginning of the stream. It's funny. I went to my buddy's place out in Eastern Canada, out in Eastern Ontario, and it kind of felt like I needed this like metamorphosis about the channel and about the content that we were doing. And I was kind of losing motivation. But I think, like, as cheesy as it sounds, I needed like a metamorphosis for myself as a person. And like, I got home from his place on the week leading up to UFC Vegas 37, and literally and figuratively, things in my apartment and my life started to collapse. So, I got through UFC Vegas 37, but I didn't really get through to UFC 266. And all of October was just basically a write-off. UFC 267 was the first UFC event that I didn't watch because I was moving and I didn't have internet since I can't even remember. I was moving. Yeah. So my partner had freaking emergency surgery the night of UFC Busan back in December 2019, Korean Zombie versus Frankie Edgar. And I watched that fight on a television in the middle of the night in the waiting room, but I missed this card. I missed UFC 267. And I can't really remember what was the last one that I missed. I know that I watched UFC Brasilia, which was, I mentioned, I think it was March 14th or 15th, the one right at the start of the pandemic. But I didn't bet on any of that card. I did watch it. But yeah, just because I was so stressed out over losing my job because of the pandemic and everything that was going on as far as everything. But as far as UFCs that I've missed, I think it's probably UFC 215 back in September 2017. Nunes Shevchenko 2, which again, that was the week after, or no, it was 2 weeks after McGregor Mayweather, which was just after I quit the bar. So I was just unplugged in that. I think it was at my cottage that weekend. But after that, I was right back into the UFC as a devoted viewer and bettor. Because I remember 216 was Tony versus Kevin Lee for their interim lightweight belt. 217 was GSP versus Bisping. And also when Rose knocked out Joanna as a plus 450 underdog, I was on Rose in that fight, so I definitely remember that. I remember Jimmy was on Rose in that fight too. And then UFC 218 was Holloway versus Aldo 2, which I remember watching because I just watched it for the tape study of Aldo versus Rob Font. So again, without getting into too much detail, I hope that puts things into a little bit of perspective. Things were so stressful for me that I broke my over almost 4-year UFC event viewing streak. And it was just all having to do with compounding factors involving the apartment me and my partner were living in, my employment situation, COVID, all those things tied together. It was just not a really good time. And I had no motivation to do anything involving Combat Odds HQ and this channel. So it kind of just fell away by the wayside. But, we moved into this apartment that I have now. Things have gotten better. I got the studio going. I've got a few new gigs. So we're making money. We got some free time. So I just needed to lay it all out there. As far as who I am, where I come from, what my background in all of this was, because there was never really any introduction made on Combat Odds HQ on the channel. We kind of just hit the ground running and assumed everybody knew what the story was. So yeah, that's me. I'm Al Mack. Follow me on Twitter at Al Mack Odds. And yeah, I'll be the main host and content creator of Combat Odds HQ. So yeah, thank you for letting me do that. Because that brings me to the final part of the stream, and it will likely be the shortest, because I want to get back to creating some content and talking about fights, because I don't like talking about myself. I like talking about fights and picking fights and betting on fights. So this is literally like the only time in the past, for as long as I've been creating content as a sports betting content creator, this is literally the only time I've ever shared anything personal, basically.